Welcome back to Sip&Talk. I'm Joe.
And I'm Sunny. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world.
Welcome.
You know, it is just wild to think about what actually wins a war, or even just what makes a country powerful in the grand scheme of things.
Oh, absolutely. It's never what you think it is.
Right, because if you look back at Israel in 1948, they didn't have this, established, heavily funded Air Force.
Not even close.
What they had was a desperate need, basically zero budget, and an $850 remote-controlled toy airplane.
Which is just crazy to think about today.
It really is. They took that toy, modified it with whatever scrap materials they could literally just find lying around, and essentially built the world's first functional combat drone.
That of sheer necessity. It wasn't about pushing the boundaries of theoretical physics. It was just about immediate survival.
Exactly. And then you contrast that $850 miracle with what we see today. You look at Silicon Valley right now, and you have venture capitalists throwing hundreds of millions of dollars at artificial intelligence programs whose primary achievement is, frankly, writing slightly derivative poetry.
Or, generating weird pictures of hands with too many fingers.
Yes, exactly. It really makes you wonder if we have completely lost the plot on what actually drives innovation.
Well, the disconnect between the sheer cost of an innovation and its actual survival value it's never been wider. We're in an era where massive capital often just masks a lack of true ingenuity.
And that disconnect is really the foundation of what we are unpacking in today's deep dive. We are looking through Eduardo Giglio's new book, Tech Tides: How Innovation Shapes Global Power.
Such a fascinating read.
It is. His core premise is that we have crossed a historical threshold. Global dominance just isn't about counting bombs, tanks, and fighter jets anymore.
Right. The new currency of supremacy is data, artificial intelligence, and these massive technological partnerships.
And just to set the stage for you listening, we are going to be touching on some very real, very current geopolitical dynamics today. The data covers actions by current political figures, including President Trump, and analyzes ongoing global conflicts.
Like some heavy stuff.
Yeah, so I want to be super clear up front. We are acting purely as viewpoint arbitrators here. We are not taking sides or endorsing any political stance. We are looking at all of this strictly to understand the raw mechanics of how power and innovation actually operate. We're just mapping out the geopolitical chessboard based on the data.
I think that is a really critical distinction to make. The goal is to understand the underlying logic of the next couple of decades.
Yep.
Giglio argues we're heading toward a massive global power struggle that will peak around 2040,
right,
and it will be entirely dictated by these tech tides.
So what really surprised me while reading Giglio's framework is how he breaks down the actual mechanics of a nation's power.
Oh, 5 stages.
Yeah, he maps out a national innovation ecosystem into 5 distinct stages, and he puts traditional R&D, like the stuff we usually praise and throw awards at the very bottom.
Yeah.
He calls that first stage sustaining innovation.
Right.
That's just upgrading existing systems, like making the battery life 5% better.
Which is necessary, obviously, but doesn't win the future. The mechanism of moving beyond that baseline is where ecosystems either thrive or they completely die out.
So how do they move past it?
Well, to move from sustaining to the second stage, which he calls breakthrough innovation, a system has to explicitly step outside its comfort zone. It requires pulling in non-traditional open-source ideas and taking significant risks.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then you reach the third stage, disruptive innovation. And this isn't just, a cool new gadget. It's when you actually reinvent the underlying business or operational model so completely that the old way of doing things just becomes obsolete.
And then you have the fourth stage, which is basic research.
Exactly.
Is the massive foundational investment in pure science. The stuff that might not pay off for 3 decades, but when it does, it rewrites the rules of reality. But the linchpin of Giglio's entire theory, the reason those first 4 stages inevitably collapse without it, is a 5th stage.
Frugal innovation?
Yes, frugal innovation.
Which is the ability to drastically lower the cost and complexity of a technology to improve its application. That 1948 drone is the ultimate proof of concept for this.
Because they had no other choice.
Right. Frugal innovation forces efficiency. It forces a kind of ruthless creativity because you don't have the luxury of solving a problem simply by throwing $1 billion at it.
And Giglio contrasts that exact frugality with what he calls the biological decay of modern superpowers.
I love that term.
It's so visceral. He uses this biological metaphor to describe how dominant nations or even massive tech hubs basically just get fat. They achieve a level of supremacy, the money starts pouring in, and they lose that hungry edge.
They get comfortable.
Exactly. They start suffering from a sort of institutional obesity, getting totally distracted by hyper-expensive vanity projects.
You really see this if you consider the staggering numbers from the Bloomberg and McKinsey 2026 Technology Outlook Report.
Oh, those numbers were mind-blowing.
The United States and China are currently locked in this massive race for dominance in quantum computing and generative AI. We are talking about a $500 billion ecosystem. $500 billion.
That is just, I can't even fathom that amount of money.
But here is the kicker. The report highlights that roughly 40% of those funds are entirely wasted.
40%. It's just vanishing into redundant research, chasing hype cycles, and inflating financial bubbles where a startup just slaps the letters AI on their pitch deck to secure $50 million.
Yep. That 40% waste is the textbook definition of biological decay. When an ecosystem becomes so accustomed to limitless resources, it falls into what Giglio calls a capital trap.
A capital trap.
Right. You forget how to engineer elegant solutions. Your innovation pipeline becomes sluggish and bloated. And that makes you incredibly vulnerable to a leaner, more frugal adversary who is actually solving the core problem.
Okay, I have to challenge this premise just a little bit, though.
Go for it.
An $850 toy drone absolutely won yesterday's war. I get that. But we are talking about the 2040 race for what Giglio calls the world brain.
Right, the integrated network.
Yeah, and just to clarify that concept for you listening, the world brain is this idea of a globally integrated network where quantum computing and advanced AI are fundamentally processing global logistics, military strategy, and economics all in real time.
It's massive.
It's a completely different weight class from a toy airplane.
Yeah.
You cannot build a functional quantum processor in your garage using spare parts to break military-grade encryption. Aren't modern superpowers forced into this expensive capital trap just by the sheer physical reality of subatomic engineering?
That is a really fair point, and you are hitting on the central tension of the quantum era here. The barrier to entry for subatomic engineering is undeniably in the billions.
Right.
You need absolute zero cooling systems. You need these hyper-specialized fabrication plants. But the core of Giglio's argument isn't that advanced tech should somehow cost $85. His argument is that an ecosystem defined only by its ability to burn cash is inherently fragile.
So it's not the absolute cost of the lasers and supercomputers, it's the mindset of the people managing them.
Precisely. It is the exact opposite of a frugal mindset. When $200 billion of a $500 billion initiative is wasted on redundancy and hype, that is not the unavoidable cost of quantum physics.
Right. Physics doesn't require you to waste money on a bad pitch deck.
Exactly. That is the cost of a broken, inefficient system. It demonstrates a profound lack of strategic focus. And that inefficiency at the technological level almost always mirrors a deeper structural rot within the nation itself.
Which is a perfect segue, because if a superpower's tech sector is burning cash on illusions and redundant projects, what happens when that same bloated inefficiency infects its domestic politics?
It gets ugly.
It really does, and this is where the data gets incredibly revealing. The January 2026 issue of Foreign Affairs published their Global Democratic Resilience Index, and it looks specifically at how domestic military deployments impact international power.
It's a really fascinating metric for structural health.
The data shows that when democratic nations increase the deployment of military or quasi-military forces domestically, like the recent highly publicized border and state-level militarization initiatives under Trump here in the U.S., their international credibility among allies drops by an average of 12%.
12% is a massive drop in diplomatic capital.
It is, and NATO is reportedly very anxious about this exact trend. They view it as an inward-looking shift.
Well, the diplomatic implication is severe. If a supposed superpower has to utilize military-grade force simply to manage its own domestic friction, it signals to both allies and adversaries that the underlying social contract is fracturing.
You are projecting weakness, not strength.
Exactly. You look vulnerable.
Which perfectly sets up the counter-argument from Daron Acemoglu, the Nobel laureate and economist. He looks at Giglio's premise that tech tides dictate power, and says Giglio has the causality completely backwards.
Yeah, Acemoglu does not pull his punches here.
Not at all. Acemoglu argues that an innovation ecosystem is the result of good, inclusive institutions, not the cause of them. You cannot just tech your way out of institutional failure.
The mechanism behind Acemoglu's argument is rooted in human psychology and basic sociology. Remember that breakthrough innovation stage 2 of Giglio's model requires the freedom to take risks.
Right, to deviate from the norm.
Yes, and to fail safely. If a nation's political system becomes predatory, or if it relies on surveillance and force to maintain internal order, it inherently punishes deviance.
That makes sense.
In a predatory system, AI doesn't become a world brain for solving logistics. It just becomes a hyper-efficient tool for domestic control. And that surveillance state permanently blocks the psychological safety required for the breakthrough stage. You literally suffocate the very creativity needed to innovate.
But wait, couldn't we view domestic protests and political friction through a slightly more optimistic lens?
How do you mean?
Think about how software is developed. It crashes, it has bugs. The process of making the code better is inherently messy. Maybe a democracy's chaos, the protests, the intense polarization, the constant arguing, maybe that isn't a sign of terminal institutional decay.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Maybe it's just the system debugging itself in real time. Like, an authoritarian system might look perfectly stable right up until the exact moment it shatters completely under pressure, whereas a democracy is just constantly loudly recalibrating.
That is a great analogy. The debugging metaphor is highly accurate for measuring institutional resilience, because a resilient system isn't one that avoids stress entirely. It's one equipped to absorb that stress, process it, and correct its own errors without collapsing.
Exactly.
And Acemoglu's point is that as long as the institutional mechanisms, the courts, the elections, the free press, as long as they are the tools handling that debugging, the friction is a sign of life. The danger, and this ties back to that foreign affairs data on domestic militarization, is when a government bypasses the debugging software and just hits the hardware with a hammer.
Wow, yeah, because once you rely on a hammer to solve a software bug, you stop writing better code. You stop innovating altogether.
And if the structural health of those institutions matters more than the tech itself, we have to examine what happens when a society trusts its digital code too much and completely ignores physical reality.
And this is where the hardline geopolitical realists step in and just completely dismantle Giglio's tech optimism.
They really do.
To understand the sheer danger of over-digitalization, the sources point to a truly sobering historical lesson: the 2023 Hamas attack on Israel. In 2023, Israel possessed what was widely considered the most advanced, impregnable security infrastructure on the planet.
Unmatched globally.
They had the Iron Dome, autonomous seismic sensors, AI-driven surveillance cameras, and these incredibly sophisticated digital intelligence networks.
It was a textbook example of Giglio's advanced innovation ecosystem applied to national defense.
And yet, that multi-billion-dollar digital fortress was catastrophically bypassed. It wasn't hacked by a superior quantum computer. It was bypassed by low-tech, brute force physical reality.
Which nobody was looking for.
Right. Hamas used bulldozers to breach physical fences. They relied on face-to-face analog messaging to evade digital surveillance entirely.
The sensors were flawlessly calibrated to detect a high-tech signature that simply wasn't there. This illustrates the concept of the fatal digital blind spot.
It's terrifying.
The mechanism is simple but deadly. When an organization, a military, or an entire nation becomes entirely dependent on a digital interface to understand the world, they lose their human intuition. They forget how to interpret analog signals.
The sheer sophistication of their technology created a false sense of security, and that was easily exploited by low-tech reality.
This is exactly the critique brought forward by political scientists like John Mearsheimer and technology critics like Evgeny Morozov. Mearsheimer's brand of geopolitical realism is incredibly blunt.
Yeah, he doesn't care about the tech hype.
Not at all. He argues that all the data centers, the generative AI, and the theoretical world brains mean absolutely nothing without hard power. You need physical territory. You need secure supply chains for food. And most importantly, you need energy.
Because the computational power required for an AI world brain demands a staggering amount of electricity.
Exactly. Mearsheimer points out that if an adversary can sever your supply chains, cut off your oil, or physically target your power grid, your multi-billion-dollar quantum computer is just a very expensive, very cold paperweight.
And then Morozov takes that realist argument a step further. He attacks the idea that tech is some kind of magic wand for complex human issues. You cannot solve political polarization with a new smartphone app. You cannot code your way out of structural wealth inequality.
It's the anti-tech determinism angle.
Right. He essentially says if technological innovation were the single deciding factor in global power, Silicon Valley would have a permanent voting seat on the UN Security Council.
Sovereignty, in the eyes of the realists, still relies on the physical monopoly on force and the ability to sustain a human population. Technology acts as a massive multiplier of power, absolutely, but it cannot serve as the foundation of it.
But see, this is where the conversation takes a wild turn for me, because even though Silicon Valley doesn't have a literal seat at the UN today, Giglio argues that we are rapidly entering an era of corporate sovereignty, where tech giants basically act like they do.
It represents a fundamental shift in the architecture of international relations. Giglio observes that tech leaders, executives at companies like SpaceX or OpenAI, or these massive data brokerages, they are increasingly operating as digital ambassadors.
We've actually already seen the preview of this. During recent global conflicts, sovereign nations have had to negotiate directly with private satellite internet providers just to keep their military communications online.
It's unprecedented.
The fate of a military campaign was literally sitting on the desk of a corporate CEO.
For centuries, diplomacy has been strictly nation to nation. Washington negotiates with London. Beijing negotiates with Paris. But Giglio suggests the 2040 geopolitical landscape will be heavily defined by nation-to-corporation alliances.
That is wild to think about.
A country's national security might depend entirely on its strategic partnership with a global tech monopoly, rather than its treaty with a neighboring state.
Think about how that completely rewrites the rules of diplomacy. If a private corporation has more geopolitical sway, more control over the flow of information, and more influence over global logistics than a mid-sized country, traditional foreign policy is it's obsolete.
It really is.
State departments are going to have to hire tech policy negotiators who treat CEOs with the exact same diplomatic protocol as heads of state.
Furthermore, because these corporations operate globally, unbounded by physical borders, and they iterate their technologies at breakneck speeds, Giglio argues that traditional, slow-moving legislative governments cannot regulate them effectively.
They just can't keep up.
The bureaucracy simply cannot keep up with the code. This is exactly why he proposes the creation of a UN of AI.
A global governing body specifically dedicated to artificial intelligence.
Yes. An international coalition designed to establish enforceable mechanical guardrails around autonomous technology. Because without an overarching framework, the race for the world brain will inevitably push corporations and nations to cross critical thresholds, particularly regarding the integration of AI into kinetic warfare and autonomous weapons systems.
And it is really worth mentioning for you listening that Giglio's urgency regarding this UN of AI isn't purely an academic exercise for him. It is deeply personal.
That really struck me, actually.
Yeah, the sources point out that Giglio is driven by a family history of genetic brain cancer.
That context frames his entire perspective on the tech tides. He views this rapidly advancing autonomous technology as the ultimate double-edged sword.
He looks at AI and sees an existential threat if it's weaponized or unleashed without structural guardrails. But simultaneously, it represents humanity's ultimate salvation.
Right, the medical potential.
Exactly. The raw computational power required to map proteins and solve something as impossibly complex as genetic brain cancer is exactly the kind of breakthrough he is tracking. He is terrified of the technology's potential for destruction, but he desperately needs its potential for a cure.
It perfectly encapsulates the human stakes of the 2040 power struggle. We are building machines that possess the capacity to either destroy our institutions through conflict or cure our most devastating diseases. And the window of time we have to dictate which outcome we get is closing rapidly.
We have covered a massive amount of ground here today in this deep dive. We went from $850 modified toys to quantum capital traps, the mechanisms of democratic debugging, the fatal blind spots of over-digitalization, and the dawn of corporate sovereignty.
It's a lot to process.
It is. But we always want to bring these massive, abstract, global chess matches down to earth for you. Why does any of this matter to you listening right now while you commute to work or prep for a meeting?
Because the macro trends of global power inevitably become the micro realities of your daily life. The forces shaping nations will absolutely dictate the trajectory of your career, the security of your privacy, and how you operate in your own industry.
To that end, we've distilled the core insights from all of these sources into a survival guide. Just a few points to help you future-proof yourself against these shifting tech tides. Takeaway number 1. Embrace frugal innovation in your own work.
This requires a deliberate audit of your own environment. We often use a lack of resources as a shield. We say, we can't launch a project because we don't have the enterprise software or the massive budget.
Right, the classic excuse.
But constraints are the ultimate forcing function for creativity. Look at your own business or organization and audit it for institutional obesity. Are you trapped in your own capital trap, relying on expensive tools when a lean, elegant solution would actually work better?
The ability to solve complex problems with minimal resources is just an irreplaceable skill. Takeaway number 2. Actively avoid digital blind spots. We talked about how the over-reliance on a high-tech dashboard led to catastrophic failures when the physical reality didn't match the screen.
So apply that to strategic decision-making in your own life. If you manage a team or run a department, do not let the analytics dashboard make you blind to the human element. The AI can process the logistics, but you need to retain your analog intuition.
You have to be able to read the room.
Exactly. Read the room, understand the psychological fate of your team, and verify the physical reality outside the data set.
And finally, takeaway number 3. Build a micro-ecosystem. Giglio outlines how national power relies on vast innovation ecosystems and digital ambassadors. You need to construct your own.
Do not let your career or your business become entirely dependent on a single tech platform or a single corporate ecosystem.
Because if it goes down, you go down.
Right. Cultivate a resilient, diverse professional network. You need your own personal digital ambassadors, people who operate outside your immediate comfort zone who can help you navigate disruptive changes.
It is all about cultivating adaptability at the individual level. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought.
Okay, let's hear it.
We spent some time unpacking Giglio's concept of corporate sovereignty, this idea that massive tech monopolies might rival the power and influence of actual nation-states by the year 2040. If the true superpowers of the future are actually going to be these massive, globe-spanning tech corporations rather than traditional governments residing in capital cities, does that mean in the future our most important identity won't be as citizens of a country, but as users in an ecosystem?
Oh, wow.
And if our lives are governed by terms of service rather than constitutions, who exactly are we voting for?